My name is Howard Vogel, and today is July 21, 1999. I'm at the home of Knoxville lawyer Foster Deaver Arnett, who will be interviewed today as a part of our legal history project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Foster, it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here to ask you some questions about your brilliant career, and I look forward to our conversation this afternoon. Welcome.
In 5, 4, 3, 2.
Foster, if I may, from the information that you have already provided me, I've learned that you were born November 28, 1920. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And I believe you were born here in Knoxville.
Yes, sir.
So Knoxville has always been your home.
Yes, sir.
If you would you tell us a little bit about your early childhood experiences and your mother and father?
Well, I was very blessed to have some marvelous parents. They were quite different in focus, in background, and in heritage. I've got some pictures here showing my father as a little boy playing the violin, for example, that kind of thing. You know, and just appropriately attired. His mother was a Greenwood. Greenwood was the advertising company at the corner of Commerce and State, if I remember correctly. The largest advertising company in the South and the first to use neon, interestingly enough. And Dad grew up with a very rich cultural background. But he had a number of things. First of all, he was not gifted in terms of being highly successful. He was a traveling salesman, to be blunt about it, but a great guy, big guy, about 6'2" and about 220. And mother was Edna Deaver Arnett. And that was Deaver Arnett's company, which at one time was the largest wholesale mercantile house in Knoxville at the corner of State and Commerce across from the old fire hall. She was an astonishing woman. She graduated from college in about 1912, if I remember correctly. And 2 years after I was born, she became stone deaf. I don't mean hearing impaired. I'm talking about stone deaf. And they took her all over the country trying to address this situation. And to make a long story short, she never recovered her capacity for hearing. But she was a very, very strong-willed person and a very gifted person. She, like Dad and like me, suffered the pangs of the Great Depression, and anybody that tells you that the Great Depression was a piece of cake doesn't know what they're talking about. And she was the first cafeteria manager for the Knoxville City Schools, McCampbell School on Emerald Boulevard. And she ran the Christmas program for the Empty Stocking Fund for the Knoxville News Sentinel. And she just had a host of activities. She was an astonishing, marvelous, was certainly a moving force in my life. And she and my Jean, and more about my Jean in a minute, she and my Jean were inseparable. I mean, they were just the best of friends. And as a matter of fact, and that's another story, when my Jean and I got married, why, we moved into her little house, 701 16th Street. That's at the corner of White Avenue and 16th Street, which is the only dwelling still surviving from the McClung estate, which occupied that entire block. And she and mother were just inseparable. The mother was extraordinarily she was a tough taskmaster, you know. Okay, you did all right, but why didn't you do better? You know, that kind of mindset. But she was an institution within her own time. I could talk about her by the hours. She, as I said, ran the empty stocking fund, the Christmas baskets and all that kind of thing. Had a couple of 3 tea rooms at one time or another. She was quite a gal, quite a gal. But one of my best friends is surely my severest critic.
Foster, I know the face of Knoxville has certainly changed over the years, but back in the time of your early childhood, where did you live? What part of town?
I lived on Emerald Boulevard. I was born on West 5th Avenue. The house has since been torn down. And then on Emerald Boulevard, and then where the post office is, the substation, the corner of Broadway and Washington Pike. And from thence to that little house, which still stands. I showed you a partial. I'll show you a more complete picture, which is kind of interesting, a part of the McClung estate. And the historian have just done a piece on it. It's going to be published upon the McClung estate. And that house, which is the last surviving structure within that block of the McClung estate. And it was on campus. The University of Tennessee, as I understand it, had a contract with the United States Army that they would provide housing for the professor of military science and tactics, and that was the house the university provided. But to make a long story short, the PMS&Ts, and I say the plural, didn't feel that it was suitable, so they rented it through the university to mother and dad and acquired, a residence elsewhere. This is part of the ROTC program.
Where did you attend elementary school?
Brownlow School for the first year, and then McCampbell School, then Chris Mary Junior High School, and then a remarkable institution called the Knoxville High School. It was the largest single high school in this entire area, predated essentially. Rule, for example, was a junior high school at that time, later became a junior and senior high school. But it was a very, very, well, it still stands out there. It's being used, by, I think, by the Board of Education. But it had a lot of characteristics, not the least of which it had a mix of kids from all over town. I'm talking about rich kids, poor kids, well-to-do families. I think when I was in Knoxville High School, I think that we had 3 student automobiles there. And if you look at it, it still stands. You can see why they didn't need parking lots. Matter of fact, some of the teachers didn't have automobiles.
Your high school years would have been approximately what time?
1936, 35, 36 to 1939. I graduated in the spring of 1939.
During your time in high school, what were your activities and interests away from the classroom?
Oh gosh almighty. One thing that jumps to mind, I was president of the Open Forum. And the Open Forum was what you might infer it to be, a debating society. And we had W.E. Evans was the principal there, and he was something else again. And I scheduled a debate as part of the Open Forum program resolved that we should have Sunday movies. And we had that debate, and Steve Humphreys, who is a legendary journalist, the managing editor of the Knoxville Journal, covered it. And to make a long story short, it hit all the media and so forth. The kids want Sunday movies and so forth. Well, that was fine. We got the attention we got. But I also was pulled in to Pug Evans' office, the principal's office, and kicked out of school. I called Steve and I said, "It's not funny anymore, Mr. Humphreys. I mean, I'm kicked out of school." Marvelous, a great story in the paper tomorrow. And he ran the story, and Pug Evans quickly, W. Evans quickly reconsidered and readmitted me. But a variety of things, ROTC and et cetera, et cetera. And we had a boxing team in those days too.
I have been told about your boxing prowess and also your coaching prowess, and we'll talk about that later. What sort of things did you do as a child with your family in the way of vacations or recreational activities?
Well, Dad was what we would now call an anachronism. He was a traveling salesman, and he was literally all over the country selling a variety of things. And Mother would take my younger brother Bill, who is a great guy, now deceased, would take us. For example, we spent one summer at Joplin, Missouri, for example. Sangamon Inn, I'll never forget it. And we tried as best we could, you know, in available times to Mother to join Dad with her two sons. And it was a very enriching experience. One of the things that has been a great asset to me, I've had the opportunity to, you know, through the years to travel quite widely. But that's been important, and particularly the family bonds is extraordinarily important. I weep when I think about what I perceive to be the derogation of the family bond relationship. I don't know whether that's responsive to your question or not.
Yes, it is, and thank you. When do you recall your first interest in the legal profession? When did you feel like perhaps you would like to be a lawyer?
I was in the third or fourth grade, and I had an overwhelming desire to do one of two things, either to be a lawyer or to be a military officer. And to make a long story short, we had a brand new creature on staff of the Knoxville City Schools, and his name was Mr. Gentry, Gavin Gentry's father, as a matter of fact. I think you perhaps know him, a very fine lawyer in Memphis. And to make a long story short, Mother took me to this new vocational assessment person, this Mr. Gentry, and he gave me a number of tests, and he knew my ultimate ambition was to either go to West Point or to be a lawyer. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, "I'll be quite frank, there's no way you can get in to West Point because you're so weak in math," that kind of thing. So you better direct your attention someplace else. So to make a long story short, from that point on, why focused in, I'm sorry, Mother interrupted to say, "Well, if not the military, what would you suggest?" And Mr. Gentry said, "Well, the tests suggest that he might make a pretty good lawyer." So from that point on, why I focused upon law school. And jumping ahead for just a moment, I applied to, I think it was 8 excellent law schools, including the University of Tennessee for law school. Was accepted, and this is after the military, and I'm jumping ahead. And to make a long story short, I was accepted by all the law schools except Harvard and Virginia, because they had a bottom line requirement that you had to have a bachelor's degree before you could be considered. So to make a long story short, and I'm jumping way ahead, the minute I graduated from law school, which was from the University of Tennessee, which was post-World War II, why I applied and was accepted at Mr. Jefferson's law school. And if you have not been up there, you have not lived. I kid you not. Charlottesville and Mr. Jefferson's University and the rotunda and the lawn is just mind-boggling. It's quite an institution.
After your conference with Mr. Gentry and before you graduated from high school, what thought did you give to a legal career for you?
Oh, I focused in on that. I focused because Mr. Gentry had said that his testing suggested that I might make a pretty good lawyer. And incidentally, you've got to understand the environment in which we live. My generation, Tom Brokaw's recent book, which I'm sure you're familiar with, my generation was exposed to 2 of the most catastrophic events in all world history: the Great Depression, which began in 1930-31, and WW2, which was precipitated, by Pearl Harbor. But my burning, driving ambition was to go to the University of Virginia School of Law and to be a lawyer. and I was very fortunate to achieve that, but there were a lot of bumpy places along the way.
During your high school days, were you aware of lawyers who were in practice in the community at that time?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And those who were in practice then, do you recall any of their exploits that you were aware of as a youngster?
Well, of course, you know, that you as a veteran lawyer can appreciate this. The stories are legion. The stories are legion. Some of them are perfectly true, some of them are apocryphal, some of them are laced with half fiction and half fact. But if you had to seize upon just one for illustrative purpose, it would be Ray H. Jenkins, who was a marvelous lawyer and a great guy. Later on, if you're interested, I'll tell you about Saturday afternoon when Ray Jenkins and Frank Flynn Sr. came in to see me, involving one of the moving forces of my life, a woman by the name of Gertrude Large. Gertrude Large was my longtime secretary, and I'll flesh that out if you like. She permitted them to come in and see me, and the stories abound about that.
Back at that time,
Interestingly, three of the most important influences in my life, at least three, were Mother, my Jean, and Gertie Large. And I would like to say a little something about Gertie Large as and when you get to it.
I had made a note from our previous conversations. Okay. We will be speaking of her. Back at that time, while you were
which time?
Back in high school, when you were in high school, was the courthouse a focus for the community?
Oh yeah. As a matter of fact, our culture was so enormously different then in contrast to what it is now. And of course, back in those days, television was unknown, and you know, electronic sophistication was essentially unknown. And a lot of the moving forces evolved around, quote, the courthouse. And if you look at the old courthouse, and I don't want you to look at it very carefully, it responded to that need by expanding. Have you ever noticed that the east and west wings were added on?
I think the brick's different, isn't it?
Yeah, brick's different. And then, of course, they added the criminal court building behind that subsequently, and then, of course, tore most of that down for the new city-county building.
Foster, as you look back over your elementary and secondary school years, is there a teacher or two who made an influence on your life at that time?
Oh, sure. I mean, it would, I do a disservice by being over-abbreviated, but for example, Elvin Bryant at Knoxville High School. He was a history professor, a marvelous, marvelous man, and turned out to be a dear, dear and warm friend of mine. Kind of a legendary character. You couldn't announce the time of day in his class without him taking exception to it and suggesting that you were just wrong as with. You'd have to defend every proposition upon which you stood. And then a fellow by the name of A.L. Job, Mr. Job was without question, in my opinion, the finest high school English teacher in this part of the world, And I had him 3 years, and incidentally, as a result of that exposure, and as a result of doing reasonably well in his English class, I was excused for the first 2 courses in English when I went to the University of Tennessee in 1939. But those were historic people. They were moving, terrific people, no question about it.
In addition to, of course, your parents and teachers that you had during your secondary education days, do you have any memories of others who were at that time or became significant influences on you in your life?
Oh gosh, Howard, I would be doing a disservice if I tried to recite all of them. I'm largely, like Ulysses said, largely a product of my background, and I have been I've been extraordinarily fortunate in having some dear and cherished friends, people that I grew up with. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Robert G. Reeves, a longtime retired ear, nose, and throat specialist, who had that, his father had that lovely home down at Lowe's Ferry, on Lowe's Ferry Pike, down there at the junction. He and his wife came to visit us. I'm largely, like Ulysses said, a product of the people that I've been fortunate to be exposed to. I've also known my share, fortunately small, my share of unworthy people.
After high school, you enrolled at the University of Tennessee.
Yes, sir.
And that was approximately when?
1939. That was in September of 1939, right after graduation from high school in June.
Why did you select the University of Tennessee?
Because I lived on the campus. And because, talking quite seriously, and I'm just as sincere as I can be, it was a darn good question as to whether or not I could get, and it was a minimal registration fee, whether I could generate enough money to register at the University of Tennessee. I was very lucky because that was in extremely close proximity. As a matter of fact, Mother converted our house that I've commented on sooner as kind of a hangout for a whole bunch of fellow students and that kind of thing. But it was a, if I may use the phrase, a crapshoot from quarter to quarter as to whether or not I could generate and pony up the admission cost to attend the University of Tennessee. Fortunately, it was a darn fine university then as now.
Foster, just to give us some frame of reference, what was UT's tuition back then?
Gosh, Howard, I don't know. It was extremely modest. I think maybe, and I probably am missing the mark like mad, but I think something like $45 a quarter or $50 a quarter or something of that sort. It was, and of course I lived at home and did not have to commute, but it was very, 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 very modest. And of course, to look at the university in those days, in contrast with now, after Andy Holt and Ed Bowling and Joe got through with it, there's no comparison between the university, dimension-wise or otherwise, in contrast with then as it is now.
I guess if tuition was about $45, a Coca-Cola was about 6 cents. Was that about right?
A nickel.
A nickel. What coursework did you select in your college days? What were your course interests?
I'm glad you asked that because I overlooked somebody a minute ago. I majored in history and political science and minored in German. And the head of the German department was a marvelous man. His name was Dr. John L. Kine. And someone in this Barry will relate to that was of special focus of my interest was Dr. Ruth Stevens, who was a historic individual. And tragically, because of the gender gap in those days, never became head of that department. But I majored in history and political science and minored in German. I took 3 years of college German. And I took 3 years of college German because I knew I couldn't pass 1 year of college math. And it's just that simple. But they were just, and Dean Hessler, who was dean of the College of Liberal Arts, marvelous man. Incidentally, one of the founders of a very distinguished and historic organization called the Scarabean Society. And accompanying him was, right alongside him was a fellow named Victor M. Davis. Vic Davis was the first head of the Alumni Association at the University of Tennessee, first sergeant in every sense of the word in World War I. Tremendous human, but these people were moving forces in my life.
Foster, you mentioned your participation with the Open Forum in high school. Were there other organizations that you became active in as a high school student?
Yeah, and gosh, Howard, I'm not sure that I can remember them all. ROTC, that was a big thing at Knoxville High School, a big time thing, and I was a class officer, and a few other good things happened to me.
Did you find yourself interested in organizations? Because I know you have lived a life full of participation.
Yes, I really did, because, and this was not a primary motivation, but an incidental result. I put a lot into organizations, but I got a lot more out of them than I put into them, and it was a very rewarding and enriching experience.
During your college days, what sort of activities outside the classroom did you pursue?
Golly darn, I'd have to look at my resume.
Time is limited, I might
See,
add.
I know I did, and I'm sorry, and I'm talking too much.
No, you're not.
But I was editor-in-chief of the Volunteer, you know, the yearbook, my senior year, something that was incidental but rather important to me, particularly in view of my later military career. I commanded A Company of the regiment at the University of Tennessee, and we were named the top military ROTC company in the 4th Corps area, which included 4 or 5 states. And this was consistent with my instincts for the military and so forth. And then a great number of things, Carnicus, for example, and Homecoming, and very much a major influence in my life was a Capitol chapter of Phi Gamma Delta. I was then and have continued to be a devout Fiji, if I can use that phrase with an ATO.
Perfectly acceptable, and thank you. You received many honors from your time in college. Tell us a little bit about the ones that about which you're most proud.
Oh gosh, that'd be tough, Howard, and I'd have to look at my resume to respond.
You mentioned the
to
Scarabean
yeah,
Society.
Scarabean Society, and also I was selected to be a member of the Raven Society at the University of Virginia, which at the University of Virginia is on a par with the Scarabean Society at the University of Tennessee. I've just had just a wealth of experience. I've been president of the Knoxville Bar, president of the Tennessee Bar, president of the International Association of Trial Counsel, et cetera, et cetera. I've been very blessed, primarily the product of my friends, not me.
During your college days, of course, there were rumors of war and then war. What was it like at that time to be a young man facing probable, if not certain, military service in a world at war?
Oh, I think that's an easy one. I think most of us had a totally different take on the military then as opposed now to now. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day, I was at the fraternity house while they were having lunch, Sunday lunch, and most of them brought their girls with them. And I was back in the study there listening to the radio. Truth of the matter is, I didn't have enough money to have lunch at the Phi Gamma house. And suddenly there came crackling over the radio an interruption and said, "We have just received word that the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." And I went rushing out of the study into the dining room where my better equipped friends were eating dinner and said, "Hey, Pearl Harbor's been bombed, we're at war." And of course it was dramatic. And we had such a much different culture. We were products, as I said a while ago, of the greatest depression in the history of the world and the greatest war in the history of the world, if you can use largest, most massive, World War II. And to make a long story short, I got my commission as a second John, second lieutenant, at the end of my junior year at UT, which was May of 1942, and was deferred until May or June of 1943 to get my degree. And then it suddenly occurred to me that a dreadful thing could happen. And the dreadful thing was, we might just win the war without Foster Arnett. So, to make a long story short, I left in December of 1942 before graduation, came back after the war and got my bachelor's degree.
You actually
and went on active duty.
you relinquished your deferment, is that
Oh
right?
yeah, I would just antsy as whiz. First thing I did the first assignment I got, I was duty officer for Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and the last day of the year and New Year's Day. And the first thing I did at Camp Wheeler, which was an ROTC Infantry Replacement Training Center, was to apply for the parachute infantry, and that's another story. And in response to that, that was considered an obscenity by my commander. So he shipped me off to the infantry basic course at Fort Benning, which is a terrific thing because I was not qualified to be a paratrooper. And I spent 13 weeks at Fort Benning, and that, if you've never been there, I'll take you and your pretty wife down there. It's quite a place. And came back, and the first thing I did was apply again to volunteer for the parachute infantry. And this time, my CO was outraged, and he shipped me to Camp Upton on Long Island in New York. That was a regiment that had been pulled out in response to the saboteurs from German submarines landing at Ponte Vedra and I'll think of it in a minute, where the Kennedys, right in that immediate area. And this time, to show my arrogance, I was up there, made some great friends up there in the 113th Infantry. As a matter of fact, I've got a very historic weapon dating back to the Revolutionary War that they gave me. I was the only Southern officer in this New Jersey Guard outfit up there. And so I was shipped down to jump school after, and show the arrogance, I had written Secretary of War Patterson a personal letter and said, according to AR, Army Regulations so-and-so, I understand priority is being given to anyone who volunteers for the paratroopers. And to make a long story short, I got my orders to report to Fort Benning. And also the old man called me and said, hey, I'm jerking your recommendation for promotion. So I went to Benning and then went through jump school and parachute demolition school. That's another story for another time. And then joined a very, very historic regiment. In our little tiny little parachute infantry regiment, the 511th, we only had 1,975 officers and men. And we had 2 Medal of Honor winners. And that's another story.
Foster, what attracted you to service as a paratrooper?
Oh, I considered it to be the elite, the most elite branch that I could be in. And I was full of beans and pudding in those days. And I mean, they were just great guys. I think I mentioned to you, Howard, that our general retiring just before he died mentioned that we were the greatest people in the world to go to war with, but the last people in the world we'd take home to date our baby sister. And I mean, it was just an elite group. We had, for example, 2 semi-goof-ups. I'm talking about enlisted men. And each one of those guys won the Medal of Honor. And, you know, that just blows my mind.
Foster, after your paratrooper training, you were shipped to the Pacific.
Yes, sir.
And what was your first duty station in the Pacific?
New Guinea. We went there to stage for the Philippine campaign. Went on the troop ship Cavaliers, I remember, or Sea Pike. And we were at Dobadura, New Guinea, and that's right after the 32nd Infantry Division had mopped up the Japanese there. Buna, you know, where you weren't even born then, where Life magazine would show the American GIs in the as the ocean washed in, you know, dead with the waves coming over them and so forth. So we were at Dobadura, Buna, and staged for the Philippine jump. And to make a long story short, right after the Philippine invasion took place at Leyte, and that's an interesting story. I mean, a lot of this stuff I'm kind of summarizing, but the Japanese thought that MacArthur was going to come back on Luzon. He did not do so. He evaded the island of Leyte, which is south of Luzon. So we were sent into Leyte to stage for the Luzon jump. And to make a long story short, when we got there, the Japanese responded we landed on the eastern shore by coming in from the western shore and just giving us a fit on the island of Leyte. So they pulled out my little parachute regiment to go up into the mountains for a few days to raise hell with the Japanese who were invading from the western shore, Oromok Bay of Leyte Island. And we were up there, and instead of being up there for a week, we were up there for about 6 weeks, and that's another story.
As I understand it, you actually jumped in to that
Oh yeah,
mountain terrain.
on the way into Leyte, the old man called me in. His name was Hard Rock Haugen. He was West Point, and he called me in and said, "Arnett, you're the new regimental liaison officer." And we were coming into the island of Leyte. And I said, "Well, sir, with all due respect, I've been with the 81 millimeter mortar platoon now for about a year, and I'd like to stay with my people." And he said, "Arnett, I didn't ask you what you wanted to do. You're the new liaison officer. So my job was to work out of regiment and out of battalion and to go in on special liaison missions. And to make a long story short, I did that while our troops were in the interior of Leyte. I'd go in and then come back out, go in, come back out, until the last time when I jumped in as a pathfinder. And that is someone who jumps in a day or 2 or 3 days ahead of time and puts out smoke and colored panels. And once it's safe, then Able Battery of the 457, the Parachute Artillery Battalion, jumped in. But I was so far in the interior there that I couldn't get back, so I stayed with them until we emerged at Oromok Bay.
After that parachute jump into the mountains on the island of Leyte, I understand that you were involved in combat, and as a result of that, received one of the country's high honors for gallantry and valor in combat. Would you share that story with us?
Well, it's a very, very simple story. December 12th, to understand, and obviously because of the limitations of time, why I'm abbreviating it, to make a long story short, the Japanese were superb infantry soldiers. They were savage, they were heathen, they were medieval in their outlook, but they were tremendous infantry soldiers. They were little people, but with enormous endurance and absolute dedication. And on the evening, we would fight all day. And the Japanese, we'd dig in at night, the Japanese would fight all night. Banzai! Banzai! And to make a long story short, on the evening of December, and I'm not giving some actual names for obvious reasons, on the evening of December 12th, 1944, just after we dug in, the Japanese launched the most horrid banzai attack we'd ever had. And the lieutenant who had replaced me with a mortar platoon, who incidentally was a big, good-looking guy, swarthy. If you had to pick out, someone for a pictorial to do a story, they'd pick him out. And I'm cleaning up my language primarily because of Barry, but he lost his guts and pulled my old platoon out. And as I say, I was liaison officer and I was in battalion headquarters. And so there was a big gap there in our line where he'd pulled out the 81 millimeter mortar platoon, just a great big gap. You remember we fought in perimeters and that kind of thing. So I was there, and I was obviously the logical person to take them back into the line, reestablish our line, and you know, what the heck, I did what I had to do. Curiously, the lieutenant who had pulled them out, the one who had replaced me as platoon leader of the 81 millimeter mortar platoon, disappeared after Lady. And although the rest of us have stayed very close in contact, his whereabouts have never been known. But he really blew it, and in the process, the Japs could obviously see who was very active in getting the men back to reestablish our perimeter, you know, get back in their foxhole. So they dropped a knee mortar right at my feet. I lost my right elbow.
Foster, you're too modest to add a little bit of the rest of the story, but for purposes of this interview, I'm going to add a little bit about that time in your life based upon conversation that I had with an old and dear friend of yours who was there at your side at the time of this particular event during World War II.
And who might that be?
Colonel Beetler, sir.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Colonel Beetler was very kind in his sharing of time with me to talk about his dear and old friend. And he said that at the particular time of this series of events, that there was actually a retreating action undertaken by some of the American troops, and it appeared to you to be inappropriate, and you left a position of safety in order to rally the men, to ask them to, instead of retreat, to respond to the enemy attack.
Excuse me, I didn't ask them.
Actually, Colonel Beetler would acknowledge exactly what you just said. He said it was the single most impressive act of heroism and courage that he witnessed during World War II. And it is one of many reasons that he is so pleased to call you his friend. As a result of that act of heroism on your part, you were awarded the Silver Star.
Yes, sir.
And of course you were wounded and received the Purple Heart.
Yes, sir.
That then caused a change in your military career because of your wounds. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I was on VJ night, which was what, August 13th, as I remember, and I could be wrong about that. I had waived my disability. I want to get around to that in a minute. I had waived my disability, was under orders to report back to my regiment for the invasion of the Japanese islands. And of course, VJ turned that, VJ day, VJ night, turned that all around. Kind of interesting, and this will tell you a little culture of the paratroopers. It was a matter of honor with most paratroopers that you would never, ever be arrested by an MP. And so the paratroopers evolved what we call the shoot patrol, consisting of junior officers. And on VJ night, I was at Fort Benning, waiting my orders for next week to rejoin my regiment for the invasion of Japan. And I went in with every other available shoot patrol officer, all of us junior officers and MPs, into Columbus, Georgia, which is right outside Fort Benning. And it was the first open post they had had there in about 5 years. In other words, anybody at Fort Benning could go into town. And you talk about, we had literally, I guess, maybe 200,000 GIs into Columbus, Georgia that night. And here I was a shoot patrol officer in a Jeep with a Jeep driver, and they would literally walk along and pick up the Jeep. And you know, there's not a darn thing I could do about it. But it was quite a special occasion. And so as a result, I did not get a chance to rejoin my regiment because they started, you know, pulling back.
Foster, what is the Silver Star?
Well, there are, as you know, a vast number of medals and so forth, decorations, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, I showed you just a huge list of them and so forth. But the highest honor that you can get in combat is the Medal of Honor, and each of the services have the Medal of Honor, and they're very, very, Buck Carnes Bridge, you know, on the way to the airport, for example, Alvin York, both Tennesseans, tremendous, and I want to comment about how you get these things, tremendously high honor. And then each of the services has a Distinguished Service Cross, the Army Distinguished Service Cross, the Air Force, Distinguished Air Force Cross, and that's the second one. The third one is the Silver Star, which is awarded for gallantry in action. It's kind of interesting. It's a crapshoot. It really is, and I'm using that phrase carefully. A crapshoot as to whether you're decorated or not. In order to be decorated, four things have to happen. You've got to have an opportunity to do something out of the ordinary. You've got to have the instinct to respond to that opportunity. You've got to be alive long enough to accomplish significantly what your mission is, and you've got to have a minimum of 2 people in writing to recommend you for one of those awards. Those are the 3 big awards in the military service. The Purple Heart, interestingly enough, is our oldest medal. That was by George Washington. I don't know whether you knew that or not. But as you know, I showed you a chart in there. I mean, we've got, and it's worse now. We look like the Russian army. If you'll go to Fort Benning, you'll just see. I mean, just row after row after row. That's post World War II vintage.
With the end of the war, what was your rank in the service?
Well, I thought I was a second lieutenant, but I had been promoted. I was a first lieutenant when I won the Silver Star in December of '44, and so I was first lieutenant. And I then dropped out of the reserves until I graduated from law school in 1948, went back in, was promoted to captain to major and lieutenant colonel. And then I retired in 1980 as a lieutenant colonel, and that's one of my few regrets. I should have stayed in to get my bird. I should have, but
and of course, a bird is
full eagle, full colonel.
Yes,
full colonel.
With the end of the war, what did you decide that you wanted to do as far as furthering your education?
Oh, I wanted to complete my bachelor's degree, which I did, and I very, very much wanted to go to an outstanding law school. And I think I mentioned I applied to UT and to North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and Duke, and et cetera. But to make a long story short, as I mentioned earlier, as soon as I got my bachelor's degree, I reapplied to Mr. Jefferson's law school at Charlottesville, was accepted there. That was my ultimate ambition. To go there, and it's really, really quite a place. It really is.
After coming home from World War II, how was the University of Tennessee different from the way that you left it before going to service?
Well, first of all, when I left it to go to the service, the vast population at the university, I'm talking about student body, was female. And of course, during the war, girls. And of course, right at as we came flooding out after VJ Day, well, of course, the GIs came in under the GI Bill. I want to mention that, which, in my opinion, was one of the finest initiatives ever passed by the Congress of the United States, the GI Bill. So I went back under the GI Bill. That's not right. I've misinformed you. I went back under Public Law 16. Do you know what the difference is?
No, I don't.
The GI Bill, and I'm trying to remember, I think, paid $75 a month plus your tuition. Public Law 16 was for disabled veterans. And this is a true story. You can check it out. To make a long story short, there was no way that I could have completed my bachelor's degree because I had less than a year at UT. But there was no way that I could go to Charlottesville and the University of Virginia on the GI Bill. In other words, there just wasn't enough money. So I applied for and, of course, got an award under Public Law 16. Public Law 16 was for wounded veterans who were disabled. And so instead of getting, as I remember, $75 a month, I got something like $150 a month plus, extra books and so forth. And went through law school in a reasonably civilized way, because that was a lot of money, and they a lot more, generous than the GI Bill. But the point I want to make, and you can check this out, when I graduated from the University of Virginia Law School in 1948, I got my usual check. I think it was $146 or something. And I wrote back, said, I'm returning this check. And I promptly got a letter back. They thought I was laying the foundation for writing my congressman or something. I wanted an increase. And to make a long story short, I said, hey, you don't understand. I am waiving my disability from now, 1948, for all times in the future, which incidentally was tax exempt, as I remember, because, it would not be right. It would not. It was my arm bone, not my head bone, that was injured. And so I have never drawn a penny under a pension or a disability benefit since October of 1948. And I'm entitled to no credit for that. I think that's just the right thing to do.
Foster, what attracted you to the University of Virginia Law School, among those other great ones that you mentioned?
Well, my grandfather, with J.L. Bud Deaver, with Mr. Billy Fuller, ran away from Lexington, Virginia, where their family had been for a long, long time, and got on the train because their parents were going to send them to VMI. And if I repeat myself, stop me, okay? But in any event, when they got to Knoxville on the train, my grandfather got off. And to make a long story short, he went into the Daniel Briscoe store, which was on Gay Street, up where the old bus terminal was on Gay Street. Yeah, I told you this before?
No.
But in any event, it was a cold, cold winter day, November, December, whenever it was, and he went into the Daniel Briscoe, and incidentally, our son married a Briscoe. That's kind of interesting, 80 years later or whatever. Went into the Daniel Briscoe Mercantile House, and they had a bunch of pot-bellied stoves around. And he went up and said to Mr. Briscoe, do you mind if I warm my hands? And Mr. Briscoe said, go ahead, boy, that's all right. So while he was warming his hands, he picked up a broom and started sweeping around one of these pot-bellied stoves. And Mr. Briscoe came up and said, boy, I told you I didn't need no help here. Well, put down that broom. He said, Mr. Briscoe said, you don't understand. You're nice enough to let me warm my hands. The least I can do is to tidy up. He said, I like you, boy, and gave him a job at something like $5 or $10 a month. And from that came Deaver Arnett's company, which, as I mentioned, I think before, the largest wholesale mercantile out. And then, interestingly, because what comes around again, interestingly, prospered mightily, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until the Great Depression came along, and it wiped him out, just literally wiped him out, and lost his interest in my uncle, Ernest Deaver, became president, just wiped him out financially and so forth. But he was quite a guy.
When you enrolled at the University of Virginia Law School, did you know what type of lawyer you wanted to be?
Well, I have always tried to be honest with myself and to acknowledge up front my weaknesses, and then to try to analyze my strengths, if any. And my focus was, because my entire background suggested it, that I might make a pretty good trial lawyer. We call them litigators now, but trial lawyers. So that was the main focus of my interest, and that's quite a place. We had Gerard Glenn and Leslie Buckler and Money Boyd, who were just historic people, and we had it was just an environment and a challenge, and the competition was fierce, because remember, I came tumbling out in 1946 to go to law school together with several other million guys that were going to law school, medical school, or college, that kind of thing.
You probably had some classmates there with you at UVA Law School who have gone on to do notable things. Who among your classmates has also gone on to excel in the legal profession?
Oh gosh, I'd have to get down my picture of our class reunion to answer that. One of them, obviously, is mentioned to you before, is George Joseph, who is one of God's great creatures. I'm serious. He and Ann, if everyone was like them, we'd have about 1,000 lawyers now to draw up wills and that kind of thing, and nothing else. But Frank Dale, for example, who was a publisher of the Cincinnati Enquirer and president of the Cincinnati Reds, and just a bushel of them. You slipped up on me that I hadn't looked at my picture, but we had a number of just, astonishing, outstanding people.
Who among your professors made a profound influence on you at the law school?
Oh, as I think I mentioned, Money Boyd, for example, who was blind. He was blind, and he would come in and remember, he had to have a reader. He couldn't even read, and he would come in and say during class in one of the big amphitheaters up there, if you haven't been in Clark Hall, you ought to go up there, and if you haven't been in the new law school, you ought to go up there. It'll blow your mind. And you'd say, gentlemen, because he could sense, the change of weather. I think it's about to rain. Just stone blind. Brilliant, encyclopedic mind. Leslie Buckler and Gerard Glenn were highly successful practicing lawyers at the New York bar. Totally different. Leslie Buckler was very much of an extrovert. Gerard Glenn was very much the scholar. But they and others, Dean Ribble, who incidentally was a classmate of Chief Justice Hamilton Burnett at the University of Virginia. They're almost uniformly first rate.
While you were a law student at UVA, was it your ambition to return to practice in Knoxville?
Well, that was a circumstance that over which I had only limited control. Dad had died in 1945. Mother was here. As I've told you, mother was stone deaf, not hearing impaired, but stone deaf. I had roots that had gone back here, and so I never seriously, although the interview process then, as now, is extensive. I'm talking about interviewing in New York and Chicago and St. Louis and so forth. But I was determined to come back to Knoxville because of the very, very strong linkage I had with my mother. And she, in my view, it was appropriate that I return to Knoxville. So that was my focus.
Foster, I'm going to suggest that we take a break now for just a few moments, and when we resume, I'd like to begin with the wonderful lady you refer to as my Jean, and the beginning of your life with her.
That's an interesting story. She's a great gal.
Yes.
Great gal.
Foster, how did you and Jean meet?
Oh, that's an interesting story. I came back from the military a couple of days before I met Jean. We had a fraternity party, 1517 West Cumberland Avenue at the Phi Gamma House. And the Phi Gams were entertaining the AD Pies. And to make a long story short, I showed up in uniform. And the reason I showed up in uniform is because I had nothing else to show up in. And I saw this cute little 4-foot 10-inch gal there, vivacious, sparkling, this kind of thing. And so we met there. And then I'm jumping around a little bit, but then we became seriously interested in one another. Now we're talking about 1946, okay? And this is kind of an interesting story, maybe. But Gina and I were very serious with one another until right after the Chinese came over the Yalu River in North Korea. And to make a long story short, I still was, you know, I was doing okay, but I've never felt sorry for myself for having to live on a nickel or a dime, but, you know, I felt a responsibility to my wife. So Jean and I were seriously courting when the Chinese came across the Yalu River. When was that? 1951, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, 51. And to make a long story short, I had kind of an interesting, intense military career. I just touched upon it. And I got a call from Washington. And to make a long story short, it was the Department of the Army. And they said, your name has come up on the computer or whatever they had. And you know about the Chinese. And we need to talk with you. And will you go down to Miami today or tomorrow? See a very prominent lawyer down there who was Wild Bill Donovan's #2 man in World War II. This guy, you know, the OSS, the CIA, which later became the CIA. So I went down there, and this is rather interesting, and apparently I passed muster, and he said, okay, here's a ticket to Washington. I want you to go up and interview with so-and-so. So I immediately left for Washington, and to make a long story short, they wanted me to come in to the CIA. And I'll give you the end of the story in a minute. And to make a long story short, it was strictly a volunteer assignment, but apparently my credentials met muster. And to make a long story short, I came back on a Saturday morning and went to Morristown, Tennessee. My Jean is from Morristown. And Jean's father and mother, great people. And Jean could see that I was kind of uptight. And to make a long story short, and this is my version of it, Jean will have a different version. I told her, I said, at that time I was a major, I guess. Yeah, a major, I suppose. And I told her, I said, look, I can't go into details, can't tell you anything. I'll tell you in just a minute. But I've been invited to go on a very, very high-risk venture, And you and I have been courting since 1946. And you know how I feel about you, and I think I know how you feel about me. And you've got, this is my version, and you've got 3 choices because this is a very, very high-risk proposition. And one choice is that we can break up, shake hands. Second, I can give you a ring, or third, we can get married. According to my version, she jumped up and down and said, let's get married, let's get married. So we got married on 30 days' notice. And I'm talking about with 12 male attendants, 12 female attendants. And, but in any event, to tell you a little bit about this mission, and then I'll complete this rambling discourse. This mission involved a good many of my friends. We were a very, very close outfit. I'm talking about the Pathfinders and the Parachute Infantry, a very, very close outfit. And our mission was to jump into Red China and raise hell. I checked some years thereafter, and about 80% of those people were never heard of again. And the reason I didn't go, I went back right after the honeymoon, went back to Miami to this historic #2 guy, to General Wild Bill Donovan. And I told him, I said, I made a commitment to you. Yeah, I'm available. You know my situation. You know that I'm a young lawyer and so forth. I want your advice and your recommendation as to what I should do with respect to this opportunity. And I'm paraphrasing it, but something to this effect. He said, Foster, as you know, things have cooled down quite a bit since the Yalu River invasion. And on one condition, I would suggest that you defer going back on this mission, with the one condition that if things worsen, that I will have the right and the opportunity to call you and you're gone. You understand that? I said, yes, sir, I do. So to make a long story short, I never had to fulfill that mission in Red China. But I tell you, it was a fun type thing. I've had a lot of adventure in my life. I really have. You know, kind of the philosophy is this a private fight or can anybody join in? That kind of thing. Now, forgive me. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I rambled.
Jean's maiden name was Medlin.
Yeah, Jean Medlin.
And she grew up in Morristown.
Morristown, which tragically is now called Morristown. No, her father was in the hosiery business. Fine father and mother, but as I think I mentioned before, and if I didn't, I even want to reemphasize it. Jean has been a major influence in my life. Jean has had some significant health problems, and she's addressed them with gallantry and great courage, and she's quite a gal. She's quite a gal.
You have children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
Tell us about those.
Well, the oldest is Melissa, and she has three great little guys, Ransom, Hunter, and Creighton Foster. I think they're 13, 10, and 8. Tremendous guys. They call Jean, they call her Gigi, and they call me Sir. And occasionally I'll say something to one of them, they say, yeah, and I say, what? They say, Sir, like that. But they're just terrific, and Melissa Lee, our daughter, the mother of the three little guys, lives up on Lookout Mountain. She's got about 3.5 acres, and she's a terrific gal. And then our son, I'm very proud of him, and I'll mention something that I think will ring a bell with you. He is the information officer for the Knoxville Police Department. He's been on radio and television, et cetera, et cetera. He's quite a guy. I have enormous respect for him. To make a long story short, Howard, I don't know whether you have thought about it or not, I'm sure you have. The two occupations or professions at greatest risk are policemen and lawyers. And the reason being they have so much opportunity to do inappropriate, dishonest things. And I'm immensely proud of Foster, and he's married, as I said, to Dottie, Briscoe, you know,
Yes.
back to the old home that I showed you the picture of.
Foster, in my research and preparation for this interview, I spoke with some of your friends of long standing, and they indicated to me that you have had somewhat of a history as a prankster. Can you confirm that?
I deny it emphatically. The man they put on. No, I was the last of my generation, and we had a very close camaraderie, a very close-knit bunch of marvelous guys. And I was the last to get married, and I think I may have mentioned this before. When Gina and I got married on such short notice, they deluged. Deluged. She had 12 attendants, I had 12 attendants, and, but we've always, played. Well, let's put it this way. My fraternity, and if I've said this before, forgive me for repeating, my fraternity's motto, did I tell you that?
No.
Friendship, the sweetest influence. I'll go to hell for a friend. I really will. I'll go to hell for a friend. Now, I've had my share of jerks, and I'm serious about that. But my relationship of friendship, with the exception of an occasional Brutus, Judas Iscariot, and Benedict Arnold, has been legendary. And I've been extremely fortunate in having that coterie of just marvelous, wonderful, decent people.
Foster, as a young lawyer, how did you start practice?
Well, I was committed to return to Knoxville. It's just that simple. I mean, graduating from a national law school, I obviously had opportunities in the large metropolitan areas where I guess a majority of our new law graduates go to or locate and so forth. But for familial reasons and so forth, I limited my search to Knoxville. And to make a long story short, that's where I came back to practice for $100 a month plus a percent. And incidentally, talking, I don't want to get out of line. I don't want to get appropriate. I had a fairly good history, a fairly good background, and I was 28 years old, okay, but for $100 a month plus a percentage of the business that I would bring in. Quite different from today, isn't it, Howard?
Yes, it is, Foster. Who did you begin your practice with? Who were the lawyers with whom you associated?
Well, to make a long story short, right at the end of World War II, there was a tremendous reconfiguration of law firms. And two of the fine roll law firms were Kate Smith, Tate and Long, and Fowler and Fowler. And General Cates, the bridge named after him, former Attorney General of Tennessee, and Mr. Charlie Smith, one of the great lawyers this century, and Judge Hugh Tate, who was with the Interstate Commerce Commission, served there, and Mitchell Long. And let me digress just 1 minute about Mitchell Long. What you now know as the faculty club or the university club was the Mitchell Long home. And I digress because I think this is interesting. Mitchell Long came to Knoxville as a male secretary, for General Cates, and legal secretary. And one of his other partners, who shall remain nameless, had a son or son-in-law that he brought in to read law. Now we're talking about in the turn of the century. And to make a long story short, the one who had been invited to read law and then to take the bar wasn't worth a darn apparently, and did not, seize his opportunities, so let him go. So General Cates asked Mitch Long, this country boy from West Tennessee, if he would like to fill that slot, to read law and to become a lawyer. And Mitchell Long jumped at the opportunity, and subsequently became licensed and founded, for example, Sturkey Brothers, the whole Hamilton National Bank, backing up a minute in World War I. He was with, I think, the 117th, Luke Lee's battalion. And Luke Lee, was a legendary historic character from your part of the state, Middle Tennessee. And Luke Lee and Captain Long, and that's where he picked up the name in World War I, and two or three others went into Holland to capture the Kaiser, and they darn near did it, but not quite. So he came back and was with this firm, and then after World War II, why those firms dissolved, then there was a merger between the old Fowler and Fowler firm and Kate Smith, Tate and Long. It became Cates, Fowler, Long, and Fowler.
How long did you practice with that firm?
A little less than 5 years.
And then you left that firm and I think went solo for a while.
That's right. Well, as a matter of fact, I was one, and I don't want to exaggerate, and if I misstate this, I regret it very much, but I was one of the, if not the only, one of the handful of post-World War II lawyers who went solo and made it stick. I could name some names very, very familiar to you, and it would be inappropriate to mention them now, who undertook to go out solo, and the culture within the bench and bar was so different, and they couldn't make it. I was the first, to survive. And let me digress. This would be the proper place to say this. While I was with this old firm, and before I left, shortly before 5 years tenure, as I recall, they brought on an astonishing woman. Her name was Gertrude Large. Everybody called her Gertie. Gertie Large was a sometimes reformed alcoholic. Gertie Large had had 2 unsuccessful marriages. Gertie Large was acknowledged to be an extraordinary individual by anybody's dimension if she could leave the bottle alone. And so she had a very varied history. As a matter of fact, I think for a while she worked with your predecessor firm. And to make a long story short, when I decided to leave shortly before 5 years and establish my own office, Ms. Large heard about it. And incidentally, everybody called her Gertie except me. I called her Ms. Large, never called her Gertie in my life. And while I was at a reserve meeting one night, she had called Jean, and she came down and talked to her. And she said, I understand that Mr. Arnett is leaving the firm to open his own office. And she said, he hasn't said a thing to me about it. She said, I want to go with him. And to make a long story short, she and my Jean were just close as could be. And so she approached me on it, and I said, there's no way. I mean, you got a darn good job with a darn good law firm, an established law firm, and I'm an unknown quantity, and I'm going out solo, and, you know, why put yourself at risk, for gosh sakes? She said, I'm going, and if you won't take me, then I'm going to fall into my old bad habits again, you know, about drinking a little too much, this kind of thing. So to make a long story short, I left in December that firm and opened my own office on the 12th floor of the Hamilton National Bank building. And very long story short, she had given her 2 weeks' notice. To make a long story short, now we're talking about December, okay? Before December, really, because she'd given her notice. And I've got to be careful how I say this, but to make a long story short, they kept her until February. And finally, one of the partners, who shall remain nameless, of this firm, went to the other partners and says, this isn't right. Mr. Foster is down there practicing by himself. Ms. Large wants to go with him. We've kept her from December until February. She's going. So to make a long story short, she terminated a relationship with that good firm and came down to me. And then we had, oh golly darn, we had the darndest relationship. I'll tell you, one Saturday afternoon, and for Barry's benefit and for the ladies, I'll have to sort of clean this story up. That's when we worked 7 days a week. And one Saturday afternoon, here's Ms. Large, everybody called her Gertie, and then about a 2.5 size office with my library next to it. And in walks Ray H. Jenkins and Frank Flynn Sr., Saturday afternoon. And they said, how are you, Gertie? She said, just fine, how are you all? Said, well, we're going in to see Foster. She said, you sit down, I'll see if he's busy or not. And they said, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. So they buzzed me and said, Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Flynn are here. And so I said, well, bring them on in. I'll come on out and get them. So took them into my office and closed the door. And as I say, I'll have to clean up this story because you knowing Ray Jenkins, one of the great lawyers, one of the fine human beings in the world, his language was rather florid. And the first thing he did is he walked in, he said, Frank, he said, look at these surroundings. I'd had the first privately designed law office in town. Look at these surroundings. Look at these impressive books. Look at these magnificent drapes, which I'd bought, I think, at J.C. Penney. Said, Frank, I've been all over the world. I've been to Egypt. I've been to Russia. I've been all over Europe. I've been to South America. I've been in some of the most attractive bawdy houses, and I'm cleaning it up, in the world. But I've never seen anything like this. But it was that kind of lodestone, that kind of relationship. When I came to the bar, literally, we had some of the great, one of them was your former partner, Patty O'Neill, Herb McCamel, and some of the really great lawyers in the country were concentrated right here in Knoxville.
Foster, do you have any memory of your very first case as a young lawyer?
No, I really don't. I can remember very, very well my office in this firm that had brought me in for $100 a month plus a percentage of the business I produced. It was kind of interesting. They had a curious architectural configuration. They had a long, small office which was divided about up to 8 feet to provide a sink and a place for the people to wash up. Then the rest of that area was occupied by the lawyer at a little desk. And when I say a little desk, it was one of the partner's children had made model airplanes on. It had a linoleum top and, with the razors. And I covered it with burlap, which I bought from Watson's, and a piece of glass to cover up that. And then it had a whole bunch of retired file cabinets in there. So I had just about enough room to squeeze into my chair and have the client sit on the other side. And that continued until one of the senior partners walked in and ripped his trousers on those filing cabinets. So they took those out. But it was very primitive, very, very modest environment.
As a young lawyer, who were your role models at the bar?
Oh, golly darn, Jack Dowdy, no question. Herb McCamel, Doc McCamel. I never will forget, I was making a responsive argument to him one day in a lawsuit. And Doc was, Phi Beta Kappa, you name it, Princeton, Harvard Law, the whole darn bit. And I made some smart aleck part of my argument, something about this Harvard Law graduate, and he jumped up and shouted out, because he tried to be the simple man, and he was anything but that. He was a great intellect. Asked for a mistrial. It wasn't very funny at that time. The judge overruled it. But Clyde Keehan, Ray Jenkins, and Herbie Jenkins, Jack Dowdy, Herb McCamel, Mr. Frank Montgomery, Frank Finn Sr., William Patrick O'Neill. Your former partner, William Patrick O'Neill, delightful, let me get it correct, delightful. He is the only lawyer I have ever known that when we were opposing one another across the table could read my file upside down. And I had a standard practice with Patty O'Neill when we were opposing one another to put my file in the floor so he couldn't read the darn thing upside down. But just Hugh Tapp, for example, Captain Long, for example, just tremendous. Then I've had a marvelous exposure to some great judges. Chief Justice Ham Burnett, most unassuming man in the world. Signed, he and Dr. Bob Leach, my application to get in law school. Judge T. Edward Cole, John Gilbertson. Incidentally, did you know John Gilbertson was the first ace from Tennessee in World War II?
I did not know that.
Yeah. And he was flying a P-38, getting ready to rotate back after he'd become an ace, when the P-38 flamed out and he crashed, and that resulted in all the burns over his body, and I think precipitated his early death. But he left the bench to come with me. It was Arnett and Gilbertson. But Judge Frank Wiley Wilson, tremendous lawyer, far better judge. I tried the infamous Harry Burke case down in Chattanooga, and this is a matter of record, and Mr. Burke died, I think, just within the last year. But to understate the matter magnificently, that was quite an experience, because Mr. Burke had some difficulties with the bar and the disciplinary boards, and was considered to be untouchable. A brilliant lawyer, but his value system and mine were a little different. But I tried that disbarment. But Frank Wiley Wilson was one of the great ones. Judge Bill Bertelsman of Kentucky, senior U.S. District Judge. Judge Doug Hillman. I just got a letter from him just the other day. Senior District Judge in Kentucky. Tremendous person. J. Fred Bibb. and Chancellor Glenn Woodley. Did you ever know Chancellor Woodley?
No, sir, I didn't.
Well, I'm telling you this, and incidentally, he's the one that ended up handling the Burke case after every judge in Chattanooga had recused himself. But really, just a historic guy. Could have been Attorney General of the state of Tennessee if he had been so inclined. But I've just been blessed. I want to add, I've also had exposure to some less than worthy jurists, and in that regard, I won't mention names. This would be unfair, but I could just name them off and you'd recognize them. One of them, notorious, bright as could be, totally corrupt. And to make a long story short, he was about to wreak havoc on one of my clients. And I filed a motion for him to recuse himself. And this was on opening day. This was a rural court, opening day. And this guy was bright as could be. And he called up this case, and I said, the court, please, I have a motion here. He said, what is it? And I said, may I hand it to the court? And he said, yes. And he looked at it. It was a motion to recuse himself because of incompetence and other things and this kind of thing. He said, we'll stand in recess, and you, Mr. Arnett, and so, my adversary, will come back to chambers. And we got back to chambers, and I took a court reporter with me. He said, Mr. Arnett, I've been on this bench for over 30 years, and only twice has there been a motion to recuse filed against me, and you, sir, filed them both. And he was right. I left instructions at the office with respect to this particular judge and 2 or 3 others that I didn't care where I was. My Gene and I have traveled widely, but wherever we were, I'm talking about Australia or wherever, that when these 3 or 4 judges died, I wanted to be informed so I could make a conscious decision not to attend their funeral. I didn't want to have it accidentally happen. Forgive me, I'm sorry.
Foster, what type of law practice, I of course know, but for those who will be watching this in the future, what type of law practice have you involved yourself in?
Well, it's been primarily state and federal civil practice, negligence, malpractice, just a considerable variety. I've been very fortunate in having about as much exposure to that kind of thing as anyone. I was just reflecting back, you suggested I think back. I never will forget one of my first clients was Ralph Knott, who was a grading contractor. And Ralph was a hell of a guy. He really was just a terrific guy. And he generated more cases than you can imagine. I was his general counsel, in effect. And a fellow named Vogel Rushing, who was the terminal manager for Hoover Motor Express in Knoxville. And that's when Hoover Motor, E.F.E. Hoover, had the big transport company out of Nashville. And I tried, and that's a fascinating case. I tried Monday trucking company cases. In that particular case is very interesting because in the first case we got hit, and this is interesting, I'm not mentioning any name. We got hit with the 2nd largest verdict ever rendered in Knox County. Thank heavens that the senior partner, who was really working neck and neck with me, left my name off the case. But I tried the remaining of those. There were a total of 5 cases consolidated in 4 trials. I tried the remainder of them and got a pretty good result. Bailey against City of Knoxville, which is kind of a landmark case having to do with McGee-Tyson Airport. George Dempster, I represented, and I'll have to delete names, I represented a firm here in town that ran afoul of George Dempster. George Dempster was one of the most interesting people this community has ever produced. Little fella, bald-headed, dynamic, fiery, and so forth. And he loved a tussle. He loved a brawl and that kind of thing. And he was mayor. And to make a long story short, I was representing well-known company here in town with respect to revocation of his licensure before city council in the old city hall down there. And I was able to entice George Dempster to lose his, and incidentally, he and I became great friends. He was a very able guy, no question about it. And I pulled his fuse, and he bet on it, and was just giving me hell. And I never will forget, so long as I live, two councilmen, Max Friedman and John T. O'Connor, John T.'s
Yes.
grandfather, called him down for picking on this nice young lawyer. And of course, I just stood there helpless. I mean, just tremendous. All three of them. George Dempster, I was a great admirer of his, and obviously of Mr. Friedman and Mr. O'Connor. The Blue Diamond Scotia mine disaster case, where we lost Blue Diamond and Bert Combs. Have I mentioned this before?
Before our interview, yes.
But in the interview?
No.
Well, the Scotia mine disaster case in Kentucky, and Bert Combs, who had been former governor of Kentucky and then a short time on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then to return to Louisville to establish the Tarrant Combs firm. He and I were lead counsel, and that's where I think it was 36 miners were killed in two separate explosions that took place, as I remember, over a 36-hour period. And to make a long story short, we had 36 of those death cases. Couple of comments. I am ever so proud of that plaque in there from Blue Diamond. We had a bunch of lawyers with us, but Judge Combs and I were lead counsel. And have you ever been in a coal mine a mile and a half underground?
No, I have not.
Well, you haven't lived. You ought to go down there. And, you could just hear the imaginary echoes reverberate, way back in the recesses and so forth. Then the Tracy against Finn Equipment Company case, which was a fun type thing. That's where an Irishman sent down here by a New York firm lost his hand in a mulching machine. And and I'm going to have to change some of these names because for obvious reasons, but I tried a very serious rape case for, let's call him Joe Smo and that kind of thing, which got wide publicity. He was acquitted. He wasn't innocent. He wasn't guilty. And then one other thing, I tried maybe the most widely notarized rape case in the history of Knoxville. And this has been some years ago, and I'll share with you some of the details, which would be inappropriate. But to make a long story short, it was, I never will forget, I would get calls at night while I was special prosecutor in this case from the defendant's friends telling me that what they were going to do to me and my family. And it got to the point, and you know me well enough to know this was kind of instinctive. I'd say, hey, just hold up a minute. You're going to do these terrible things to me. Just tell me, where can I meet you? And just tell me, and I'll be down there. And I went out, I guess, 4 or 5 times for these threats, we'll meet you at the Western Plaza or wherever, that kind. Of course, they never showed up. And as a matter of fact, and this is a great story about George Ballotzeris, former judge, and George, a great guy, in this very famous rape case involving very prominent people, and all these threats that were given to me. And after the jury came in and convicted the defendant in these cases, everybody streamed out except 2 people. One, me, I was deliberately taking my time to put my file together, and a fellow who was then in private practice, later a criminal court judge, a fellow named George Ballotzeris. And so I finally got my briefcase packed, and I said, George, what are you doing here? And he said, well, he'd been down there and he knew about all these threats, and they had passed word to me they'd be waiting for me outside. And as you know, George was quite a UT football player. He said, well, you and I haven't had a chance to talk. I just thought I'd stay down here. And after that kind of monkey business, I said, George, you're down here because you heard these people are going to jump me. Is that, no, I just want to walk up the street with you. I said, don't give me that stuff. I can't handle it. Oh, no, he said, you and I are going to walk up the street together. And to make a long story short, George Ballesteros accompanied me from the old criminal courts building all the way to the Hamilton National Bank to be with me in the event that these hoodlums, I'm trying to remember what they call themselves, a gang, was going to jump me. And, you know, that's very few people would do that. But in any event, the foreman on that jury, and this will add some flavor to it, that convicted the guy I was prosecuting in this very prominent rape case was a man by the name of Andy Holt.
Is that right?
How about that?
Who is Andy Holt?
Oh, golly. Andy Holt was a legend in his own time. Andy Holt had a curriculum vitae as long as your arm. Andy Holt ended up as president of the University of Tennessee statewide, not just the Knoxville campus. Got Andy Holt Towers. Andy Holt was one of God's great creatures. I never will forget, and that leads me to another story. He brought on board a fellow in state government by the name of Ed Bowling to be vice president. And I got a call from Ed one day, and Ed said, need to talk with you. I said, come on up, we'll have lunch. So he came on up, and he said, Andy wants you to be president of what we call the General Alumni Association. I had the name changed when I became president to the National Alumni Association. But Andy wants you to be president of the General Alumni Association. And we talked about it and so forth. And of course, it was very time consuming, no question about it, going literally all over the damn country. I'll get to that in a minute. And I said, well, let's go talk to Andy. And so he said, well, I'll check Andy and I'll call you. So he made arrangements with Andy. We walked in, and there was no more affable human being in the world than Andy Holt. We sat down. Here is the president, and he's got his vice president, and he's got Arnett there. And I said, Andy, I think, and Ed can verify this, Andy, Ed tells me that you would like for me to be president of the General or National Alumni Association. He said, yes, I really do. President-elect and then president. I said, well, just level with me if you will, because this is your call, and it would be inappropriate, even if I could, and I couldn't, to intrude or impose. But what do you have in mind? Does this involve kissing the homecoming queen at halftime at football games and, you know, making little talks in this area, or what do you... And I'm summarizing, but this is an accurate summary. He said no. Said, Ed and I intend to make the General Alumni Association, the National Alumni Association, the University of Tennessee, what it is, what it should be, and of right ought to be. And we want to enlarge enormously the scope and the program and so forth. And it will take a lot of work and a lot of time, and it is not like what it's been up to this point in time, which has been kind of a good old boys club. You know, have lunch at Harriman or whatever. And I said, I'm your guy. So Carolyn, Ned Boulding, and Gene and Foster Arnett, for a little over a year, went all over the country, to meetings, you name it, attending meetings. Then I became president the following year of the National Alumni Association. But if you look at it now and look at its staffing and its scope and, you know, its budget, there's no comparison. The stories abound. I'm wasting your time. I'm sorry.
Foster, what is it about you that has made you the very successful trial lawyer?
Luck, good genes, and when I say good genes, that's a kind of a euphemism. Good genes in the sense that I had marvelous parents and grandparents, and then good Jean Medlin, my current wife. Incidentally, my only wife of, 47, 48 years, whatever it is.
Foster.
And luck and good fortune, and the kids have been a delight. Our children, our grandsons, you know, it hadn't been embarrassment. You haven't picked up the paper someday and seen something that was unfortunate, that kind of thing. And also, and this is terribly important, friends. Friends. I kid you not. Friendship, the sweetest influence by fraternity motto, okay? I'd go to hell. I'm serious. If someone called me right now, interrupted and said, I can't explain, but I'm in San Francisco or wherever, I need you. I'd be on the way. I'd say, hey, Howard, sorry, pal, I got to run. I can't tell you what it's about. I got to run. And they would do the same thing.
How would you describe your work ethic as a lawyer?
Well, that's a tough question because it involves self-characterization, and self-characterization is suspicious by its very nature. But I'm inclined to think that it might be fair to say that I've always been a hard worker, and I've dreamed great dreams. And that's a self-characterization, so you've got to minus that in a number of ways.
Foster, what drew you to your involvement with the organized bar?
Well, the culture then was so entirely different, and I can tell a quick little story that will illustrate it. We only had, and I've got some numbers here somewhere if I can find the darn thing. It blows you. Oh, in 1948, now this is an approximate figure, we only had 100 and about 170 lawyers at the Knoxville bar. And is that right? About 100, okay, about 170. Since that time, we have, 1,300 at the Knoxville bar?
I think that's approximately correct.
Approximately 1,300 lawyers. In those days, this is just for instance, we had a number of lawyers who were not law school graduates, John Arnett graduates. And so our current peers would tend to sneer at that. As a matter of fact, John Arnett College of Law, and he's another story. If you haven't read anything about him, you ought to read it. They produced some darn good products. But the camaraderie was very, very, very close. One little tiny thing that contributed to that was the S&W cafeteria, which was centrally located right by the Hamilton National Bank building, the Burwell building, and the Bank of Knoxville building, and so forth, where we almost invariably every day met together going down the line at S&W. And now, of course, as you know, it's sat empty for years. For example, on one of our bar meetings, Tennessee bar meetings in Memphis, Irby Jenkins chartered 3 Pullman cars, and a bunch of us went down on those Pullman cars on the, what was the name of it, the Tennessean or whatever the name of that, you ought to know that, whatever the name of that famous train was. It was just, we saw each other, we mingled with each other, we were much closer than we are now, in my opinion.
What objectives did you have as president of the Knoxville Bar, and were you able to accomplish them?
Well, I would like to think so, and I left it in the other room, but I think I'm correct that when I was president, we won the only award of merit in the history of the Knoxville Bar Association.
And that was an award from the ABA?
Yeah, it just, no, TBA, I guess. I've got it in the other room in there. It's a great big thick submission, and I've got to give it back to the Knoxville Bar because they let me borrow the darn thing. I wanted to glance at it. But I think we had a highly successful, president-elect and president, because I prize very much my relationship with 90%, 95% of those lawyers, and most of them were motivated by not what I can get, but what can I give or what can I give more, that kind of thing.
What about your year as president of the Tennessee Bar Association? What were your objectives at that time?
Well, you got on sensitive area there, and I'll have to be very careful what I say. But we had, for example, and I got a picture of it in there, I took the Tennessee Bar to Mexico for the first mid-year meeting out of country. And I've got a picture in there where I'm fighting the bull and put the emphasis on the bull. It was a small bull, admittedly, but I was always very much involved. The International Academy of Trial Lawyers, for example, there's a great story about that. I took them to Australia and New Zealand. Well, I say I took them. That's not fair. I was president, and we went down there. And the assemblers, who were our United States ambassadors, tremendous people, invited us by for an embassy reception and so forth. And then after we did Australia and the Outback and all that, we went over to New Zealand. And New Zealand, charming, delightful place. It's not next door. It's, you know, somewhere up the ocean. But make a long story, and this is a cute story. Make a long story short, that's where they invented the bungee jump. Have I mentioned that on this tape?
Only by quick reference.
Okay. But in any event, we went over to New Zealand to complete this trip, and the International Academy of Trial Lawyers is heavily populated by plaintiffs' lawyers, which mean they have a lot of money as opposed to defense lawyers, okay? But we went to where the bungee jump was invented, if I can use that phrase, and over a great gorge there with a tumbling river underneath it, and with a platform, a spectator's platform, about 4/5 of the way up, is where you do the bungee jump. And I've got a picture of that in there. And to make a long story short, the story is told that my Gene was there with the spectators and all the other members of the Academy, and Arnett's up there getting ready to bungee jump, which is a piece of cake for an old ex-paratrooper. And they saw Gene dampening her eyes, you know, her eyes and so forth. So one of the ladies came up, said, "Honey, Gene, don't be upset." Said, "I'm sure he's going to be all right." And Gene is reported to have replied, "You don't understand." And her friend, who was trying to comfort and reassure, said, "What do you mean I don't understand?" She said, "I am not weeping because of him and killing himself, but because the old fool forgot to renew a life insurance policy before we came on this trip." And that's a true story. But those are pictures back there. Anything I tell you, you make me prove it.
Do you believe that bar association or organized bar activity is important for a member of the profession?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. I think that's part of Mr. Jefferson's policy of payback to those who much is given, much is to be expected. Mr. Thomas Jefferson. I don't think there's any question about it. What my concern is, and we don't have time to get into a debate, is the focus and the emphasis, the change of focus and the emphasis has been enormous. In many respects for the better. In other respects, not for the better, in my opinion.
From your perspective, which is substantial, what are the current challenges facing the profession?
Unauthorized, what we would have known in the old days, unauthorized practice of the law, the loss of civility and collegiality, the loss of camaraderie. Can you imagine nowadays, as opposed to 45 years ago, Ray Jenkins and Frank Flynn Sr. coming into your office, unannounced and that kind of, the focus on litigation alternatives, which is well motivated, but in my opinion needs to be thought out a lot better than that. Those are just some of the concerns. I guess maybe one of the major things, impersonality between members of the bar.
Do you aspire for your grandchildren that they would become lawyers?
That's a real toughie, because if they become lawyers, I'm talking about our three grandsons, they will be fourth generation lawyers. And if you had asked me that question If you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said yes, yes, yes. My answer now, I hope it's responsible, is I'm not certain. I want them to do what they want to do and be what they want to be, but I'm not sure that I would push them or persuade them to become lawyers. I think the deck of cards is still out there as to how this new modality, this new change in culture is working out or not working out.
If a young member of your firm were to come to you today in his or her first year of practice and ask you, what will the profession look like in 25 years, what would your response be?
I'd be doggone if I know.
Would it
As you know, Howard, from your personal and professional exposure, having had a hugely, enormously successful exposure and practice, that's one thing that is darn near unpredictable, in my opinion. You'd be in a better position to have an opinion on that than me.
Would you be willing to share with us your most proud professional moment?
You know, talking seriously, gosh almighty, you can ask some tough ones, can't you? I really don't know. I have been so richly blessed with so many undeserved recognitions and so many kindnesses that it would, gosh, I'd have to think about that a long time.
Foster, among your professional colleagues and friends have been some of the most esteemed members of the bench and bar in our country. I know of a story involving a mountain man and a former member of the United States Supreme Court. Would you share the Uncle Lem story with us?
I'd be glad to. Put it in context, Uncle Lem Owenby was born and reared in the Great Smoky Mountains, just north of the cottages at Elkmont, Tennessee. Uncle Lem Owenby was a mountaineer from word go. One year, and we're talking about 20, 25 years ago, whenever it was, the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference met. You know, that's Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan. Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference was being held at Gatlinburg, and that involves 170 some odd federal judges, magistrates, U.S. district judges, Court of Appeals, and a Supreme Court justice, at least one. And we were meeting up there, and I've been a life member for many, many years, and so I'd been invited to host. Golly darn.
Justice Stewart.
Potter Stewart and, I'll think of it in a minute. Potter Stewart, who was then on the Supreme Court of the United States, I guess, wasn't he?
Yes, sir.
Potter Stewart, and I'll think of his name in a minute. And so I approached him and I said, gentlemen, you and your ladies, tomorrow afternoon, Thursday afternoon in this conference is an open date. And, you know, it's my responsibility to look after you, and I'd just like to throw out an idea. Would you like to go up to Elkmont, Tennessee, which is a very rare historic, is from those seeds out of which the Great Smoky Mountains derived and so forth. And would you like to go up there and visit around? So to make a long story short, they said, that sounds great. So we got in the car in Gatlinburg, my Gene and I, with the two justices, and we went up to our cabin at Elkmont and had a toddy or two and sat out on the deck over Jake's Creek as it was tumbling down. And then we got ready to go back to Gatlinburg, where they were going to have the big fancy dinner that night. And as we got ready to leave the cabin, I said, gentlemen, and I'm ashamed that I can't remember the other one. I'll think of it in a minute. I said, gentlemen and ladies, one last thing before we go back to Gatlinburg for the conference. there's an old man, he's in his 90s, Uncle Lem Owenby, who is one of the original park people and the last member of the park denizens who's permitted to live in the park. He's got his bee gums up there, you know, beehive. Would you like to go up and meet him? And to make a long story short, they said sure. And I never will forget, Potter Stewart had on some kind of a crazy darn kid t-shirt. So we go up outside Uncle Lem Owenby's cabin, which is modest is an exaggeration. I mean, just a tiny little place with a little narrow porch there. And I had these two Supreme Court justices and their ladies there, and of course my Jean. And I knocked on the door, and I could just visualize, although it was in June, I could just visualize Uncle Lem Owenby sitting there with his hat pulled down over his ears and smoking a corncob pipe. I knocked on the door, and he says, "Who's thar?" I said, "Foster." "What do you want?" "So I want to see you." "What do you want to see me for?" "Well, because I have some friends here that I would like you to meet and them to meet you." He said, "Who are those folks?" And I told him the names of the two United States Supreme Court justices. And he said, "Them fellers from Washington?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Tell them to go back home. Ain't got no use for them, never did, not coming out." And he didn't. And he didn't. And to make a long story short, for years we'd get Christmas cards from the justices, you know, saying, "Tell Uncle Lem hello." And they just, you know, I was humiliated and embarrassed, but they said, "You know, we're not used to being treated this way. It's very wholesome and refreshing."
Foster, someday someone will write an epitaph for Foster Arnett. Do you have any instructions?
No, that would be self-judgment, more likely than not. I mean, I think that one thing that I have tried, and I sure don't make any pretenses of achieving it. Well, let me tell you a story about this ring, okay? Christmas of 42 or 43, I was home for the last time before going overseas. My brother was getting ready to go over about 6 months after I was going. It was our last time together as a family. I'm talking about Mother and Dad and Bill and me. And Dad and Mother gave to Bill and to me a fraternity ring. You can see it's worn down. I can't even get it off my finger. And there is one word inscribed in each of those rings: honor. And that's not negotiable.
Foster, thank you so much. We're going to move to another part of the house to look at a few of the many items of memorabilia from your wonderful career.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you.